Hey everyone, thanks for joining us again. We are back this week for the Best of the West book club with the second book in our selection, Edward Feser's The Last Superstition. And today we're looking at chapter 1, focusing on secularism as a counter-religion. Dr. Roblard, nice to see you again.
Good to see you as well.
Why do we choose this for our second book? What do we think the links are to Havel?
So Havel in Power of the Powerless, he talks extensively about the idea of ideology overtaking people and being really a suite of ideas and an organizing principle that very easily lets people opt into, and it organizes their entire worldview without them giving much thought to it. And one of Feser's main contentions is that the new atheists and the secular ideology that they're pushing now functions very much as a secular religion and an ideology, very much in the same way. So his goal of this work is to point out that the new atheists, or atheism in general, is the last superstition. That is, it has all the hallmarks of superstitious ideology that the new atheists are claiming that religion has.
Yeah, that's really well put. So the connection between the two will become clear as we explain that Feser argues that there is no science versus religion conflict. In fact, what we have is two philosophical worldviews in conflict, one of
Mhm.
which pretends to be scientific, but is actually just mere scientism. And
Mhm.
if anything, based more on faith than traditional religious faith is, which is traditionally rational.
Right. Right. Yeah, certainly. The faith is this incessant reductivism towards some version of materialism.
That's it, precisely. And before we get into the meat of chapter 1, let's begin with our opening prayer. If you could lead us, Dr. Oberlard.
All right.
Let me get it up on the screen so people can follow along.
Come, Holy Spirit, divine creator, true source of light and fountain of wisdom, pour forth your brilliance upon my dense intellect, dissipate the darkness which covers me, that of sin and of ignorance. Grant me a penetrating mind to understand, a retentive memory, method and ease in learning, the lucidity to comprehend, and abundant grace in expressing myself. Guide the beginning of my work, direct its progress, and bring it to successful completion. This I ask through Jesus Christ, true God and true man, living and reigning with you and the Father forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. So we begin then with Feser's choice of epigraph, which is that a small error in the beginning of something is a great one at the end. This is Aquinas paraphrasing Aristotle. And in many ways, this sums up the whole book, which I guess is why he chose to put it right at the beginning. And what small error is this?
Well, I would say the as he gets into it, the small error or set of small errors that he'll unveil is really is nominalism. I think is the crack in the dam. But it's furthermore a rejection of a Aristotelian or Platonic Aristotelian Thomistic tradition within the Western mind as we move from a traditional scholastic worldview to a modernist worldview. And nominalism is going to help facilitate that shift. But that shift is from that philosophical system to the modernist philosophical system is the one that then sets up the set of Enlightenment preconditions and presuppositions that now take us to where the new atheists are, and all the errors that they then make.
Yeah, and in layman's terms, nominalism is what exactly? We've talked about this before when I interviewed you a while back. How would you
Mhm.
describe it?
So you can think of Plato had his idea of the forms, and you have a let's say white piece of paper or white snow, or I don't know, uh, a white piece of chalk. And all of these things are instances of the particular instantiation of whiteness participating in the form of the universal of the color white. And nominalism, beginning with Occam, to and through various iterations, assumes that there is no universal form that any of these instances are participating in. So once you sever this connection between a universal, you're left with just a bundle of particulars and particular names, and no transcendent thing which we are coordinating really our language or our categories or the way in which we connect with the world. There's nothing. There are no joints in the world anymore for our concepts or our language to fit into. And you can see how the removal of these things over long enough time takes us to something like transgenderism, where I can just say I'm a thing, then I am a thing in my own private language, because why not? There's nothing by which these terms or concepts are anchored to anything.
And yet there's an incoherence to it because they still want to claim that they definitely are women and not men, and that they're all women together and they're all the same
Mm-hmm.
thing. So
Yep.
it pulls itself apart at the seams. And one of the interesting consequences for Darwinism, say, is that strictly speaking, on the nominalist understanding, you wouldn't even have species. You've got
Yeah. Yeah.
bears, for example, but there's nothing really that they have in common. There's
Right.
no bareness that they instantiate.
Yeah. There's just this bear and that bear and this bundle of accidents and that bundle of accidents. But yeah, if they're being true to their own commitments, then yeah, there would be no natural kind of bear that's even evolving.
Yeah, and Darwin himself expresses that doubt about whether species even exist coherently on his own view.
Mhm.
And Feser in particular picks out two abnormalities in modern Western culture that he thinks stem from this era: sexual libertinism and contempt for religion. And it's interesting that all other human societies universally have been religious in some sense and have also
Mhm.
had some kind of strictures on sexual behavior. But we live in a society where the defining hallmarks is that it has neither of those.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And both of these things seem to be looping. They both seem to be both at once symptom and cause, whereas the atheism fuels the sexual libertinism, and the sexual libertinism fuels the atheism. So in conjunction, it's yeah, a recipe for civilizational ruin.
Yeah, vicious circle leading to burnout and collapse.
Yeah.
And he argues throughout the book, as we'll be exploring, that ultimately this is the result of the modern, ostensibly, so at least on the surface, scientific worldview. But
Hmm.
actually, it comes from this philosophical error that you have picked out there.
Hmm. Yeah.
And surprisingly, for many people who might not have heard some of the traditional arguments for religious belief, Feser argues that we need to go back to first principles and that it is a certain kind of moral and religious traditionalists and not the secular liberal who is the true upholder of reason. This is something that you
Mhm.
and I have talked about because you mentioned symptoms and causes there. A lot of what's called the culture war is simply people complaining about various symptoms rather than
Mhm.
pinpointing underlying causes.
Right. Right. Very much so. And a lot of it, I think, also comes from uh, persons acting in irrational, fundamentally irrational, unreasonable ways, and ending up in vicious or suboptimal situations, and then blaming it on this thing or that thing. And we're what we're failing to see is what undergirds it is a lot of these more fundamental errors. So all of these, as we've talked about before, these proliferating rights claims, for instance, um, people might locate that as being the foundation of what's the ill of society, or is I don't get enough rights, I don't get enough of what I want, or something like that. But because I'm being oppressed, or my appetites are being unfairly limited. But that is all piggybacking upon a flawed anthropology of man and a flawed metaphysics.
And it's getting back to that sound metaphysics that the whole book really leans towards, isn't it?
Yes.
He
Yeah.
argues that classical theism and traditional morality are the only rational guiding principles for culture. And that's
Mhm.
a surprising claim to people who've been taught that faith and reason are somehow diametrically opposed.
Mhm. Certainly. Yeah. Yeah. That was the I used to be one to ascribe to that the Enlightenment liberalism was, he has a good quote about this, that was this progress narrative, that science and Enlightenment rationality was us transcending the dark ages of superstitious religious thinking, and that imminent frame is laden in not just academia, but most of the major elements of the culture. So that's just built into a lot of how people think and see the world now.
Yeah, everybody knows that faith is something you have when you don't have reason, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
That's just one of
yeah,
those given assumptions that people get taught in school or is taken
yep,
for granted in conversations, whereas it's so far removed from the traditional concept of what faith is.
yes,
And Feser makes the point that modern secularism is ignorant, stupid, insane, and wicked. And it actually undermines the very possibility of rationality itself and
hmm
morality.
certainly. And I think we see this a lot with the materialists, like Sam Harris, where they'll try to, Dennett especially, where they'll try to reduce everything to physical explanation, but what they're leaving out are whole areas of metaphysics, to include logic and mathematics, morality, aesthetics, um, any metaphysical presuppositions about other minds, and also the axioms of science itself. Right. So this is Carnap's point about logical positivism failing, is that it can't, the, the axioms of logical positivism can't be verified. So all of these things that they're trying to mash into this physicalist explanation, uh, that is a, a religious commitment, that those things can be reduced or eliminated along those lines.
Well, Havel mentioned fanaticism as one of the hallmarks of ideology. And you're dealing here with people who, rather than admit that materialism, naturalism, scientism can't accommodate rationality, specifically the human capacity for abstract thought, so we
Mhm.
can grasp universals, they'll either say, well, there aren't universals, or they'll just deny their own rationality.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They'll either shrug and say, "Well, uh, maybe it turns out we're all just deterministic anyways, and free will and minds are an illusion." I mean, Harris does this incessantly, where he'll say that, and then you'll catch him the next day complaining about MAGA Trump supporters, and this is unethical, and we ought to do something about it. So it's this really intellectually dishonest toggling between inconsistent worldviews, and I think he knows he's doing it. The other move that these folks do quite often is to say that science gives us this promissory note that, well, science will figure it out. We eventually will achieve the scientific discoveries that will unlock consciousness, the mind, ethics, etc. And that, once again, that's just as much of a leap of faith as anything else.
Well, that's one of the big things that struck me when was, well, I must have been in my early 20s and first read this book when it came out. I understood why the God of the gaps point that the new atheists make philosophically doesn't get to the heart of the matter, because
Yes. Yeah.
on the traditional classical metaphysical worldview, it's not about we believe in God because science hasn't explained this area of the world yet. It's that in principle,
Hmm.
there's nothing about science that can touch
Yeah.
this aspect of reality. And
Hmm.
a bit that caught my eye in Feser's opening remarks was that he says that gay marriage, for example, is a metaphysical absurdity and a moral abomination. Now, the idea that it's metaphysically absurd, that's
Hmm.
something you don't hear people say very often. Contrast it to
Right.
Jordan Peterson's recent remarks on gay marriage, for example, when he said that modern culture has just decided that gay marriage is now part of the structure of marriage itself.
Hmm.
Now, that suggests that it's truth by consent.
Yeah,
If
some type
enough
of
people decide
contractualism.
it,
Yeah.
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 When Feser said that's like somebody deciding that the chemical structure of gold, for example, has changed because enough people
Hmm.
believe it has.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And this seems emblematic of two totally different metaphysical positions. Phaser coming from an Aristotle's view that metaphysics and ethics are um, closely yoked together. And not necessarily that ethics reduces to metaphysics, but I mean it's very close to on that view that what is good for the plant is a strong and healthy root system, metaphysically speaking, and that is what is good for its flourishing. What is good for families is and for good for men and women and for society is the nuclear family that produces children, that produces more people, that produces society, etc. Uh, Contrasted with the Peterson view, which seems very much some type of Lockean or Millian contractualist view, where we all just agree as individuals that we have some set of rights, whatever those abstract entities are, and we distribute them and apportion them as fairly as we can. In independent of what the particular actions are that people are doing.
And,
Um,
and combined with some kind of pragmatist view of truth as well, which is,
yeah,
I guess, well,
yeah,
if enough people think gay marriage kind of works, then it must be true.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We've got some questions. Feser really hit the nail on the head when he stated modern new atheists are ultimately attacking caricatures and straw men.
Hmm.
Reminded me of Sam Harris claiming he can't see God with a telescope, so he can't exist. Yeah, why are they're smart people? These guys aren't stupid. They're well read in their fields. Why is it
Yeah,
that they don't actually engage with the sophisticated presentations of theism? We'll come to it later with Thomas Nagel. I think he does
yeah,
explain why, but what's your
yeah.
sense?
Well, I think Phaser does it pointed out well that a lot of these folks they're charlatans or sophists that are not well trained at all in the history of philosophy or in the contemporary analytic developments in philosophy, or I mean, Dennett, I suppose, but Harris, I wouldn't even count as being analytically trained at all. And then these folks they're woefully ignorant of the actual arguments and the actual core texts and the moves that are being made. And I think it's some type of hubris where they're not willing, or they never were willing to, um, so we're uh, put aside their ego and go through an actual several philosophy classes and engage these questions in good faith. Um, they weren't being open minded in the way that they're calling everybody else to.
Yeah, although you went through quite a few philosophy classes, right, and still didn't have the ideas presented to you.
Yeah. It's Phaser's account of how he was convinced of atheism and taught it during his graduate school years was identical to the way that I went through, right? Where it's like they roll out a very, very flat-footed view of the cosmological argument. They don't even talk about the argument from contingency or the idea of a necessary being. It's rather God just gets rolled out as this really big contingent cause that gets the causal chain off and going, and then who would ever believe in something like that? The Big Bang satisfies that just as well, without bringing in any theistic elements. Or we can say, well, what caused God? What caused that thing? Who would ever believe that? And because I had professors with PhD with letters after their name telling me this, I just saw, well, yeah, that's ridiculous. Who would believe these things? It's only till later on, actually coming across the writings of folks like Avicenna from the Islamic tradition. He has a necessary being argument, having read Aquinas. That was actually the sort of entry point back to considering these things at a more adult level. But when you're hit as a 19 or 20-year-old in an undergrad philosophy class, this can be really impressive if you've never seen any of these arguments before. And then you're off and running.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the Big Bang, because that theory was originally devised by a Catholic priest, and there was great hostility to it. People
No.
didn't want to accept it because they didn't like the idea that it suggested a definite beginning, because that might be a way to argue for a creator. So there was
Mm-hmm.
hostility to something leading in the direction of the traditionalist worldview, even from within science itself,
Yes.
which is your
Yeah.
point about it
Yeah.
being willful.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, these folks aren't realizing that they are protecting a particular worldview, and then it gets absolutely ridiculous when you watch Harris and company try to bootstrap ethical or normative claims from out of the mere physicalism. It's his second book was about this, the moral landscape, which is I think Anthony Appia said something about, well, he needs to or it was Simon Blackburn said he needs to brush up on his meta ethics, and Harris's reply was, the term meta ethics is a boring term, and I don't like boring words. It's like, yeah, that's you shouldn't be having this debate if you don't know what meta ethics is. So, but he plays a good like public intellectual guy. It's like a good role that he's it's a good shtick.
Yeah, it's when you start digging beneath some of the easy responses they give and think about what their core commitments are that it becomes easier to ask questions. There was that famous debate between F.R. Copleston and Bertram Russell, and Copleston just pushes Russell to basically saying the universe is just a brute fact. It's just a given. And explanation, exploration just stops there, which doesn't seem like a particularly scientific attitude to have. But that's ultimately what his response was. We don't
Yep.
seek any kind of explanation for the existence of the world at all.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's where these guys eventually end up. So
We've got one more question, which is, to what extent can this current materialistic religion be seen as just another variety of the Gnostic heresy, as has been repeatedly identified by the Catholic Church throughout the ages? That's an interesting one. So, Gnosticism is basically salvation by knowledge, and it's done by yourself. There's no need for any kind of savior. So, at its core, you could argue that the Enlightenment vision that man can become master of nature and eventually human nature has got a Gnostic faith to it. Yeah, I think that's a good connection to make.
yeah, yeah, sounds right.
Now, thinking about the tradition that you've hinted at there that most people don't know anything about, Feser points out that most philosophers and scientists across the history of Western civilization have firmly believed in the existence of God, and on the basis of entirely rational arguments. Why don't more people know this? And do you think it's because rationality has been redefined so that in principle, according to that definition, you couldn't ever reason your way to God?
Yeah, I think as we've moved from thinking of this reimagining of the human person as being a emergent evolutionary meat machine with no conscience and no inbuilt rationality or capacity to apprehend the good, the beautiful, the true, to be able to reason from our own faculties. Once that is just taken as a given, all those faculties and capacities are just regarded as not being there. Then yeah, we're going to start this picture of man is going to become looping and self reinforcing. So certain curiosities folks might have, or certain intuitions that folks might have, if they look at they just apprehend the immediate um, let's say disgust of something. They might regard that as that's not apprehending something bad about the world in a normative sense. That's just, I don't know, that's just some biochemical reaction. I see a photo of an abortion or something like that. The new atheist folks they're just going to say that's not apprehending any normative element of the world. That's just some biochemical response because something's, some sort of ad hoc story about survival, selfish genes or something. um so yeah, I think once we hit the ground running from the Enlightenment onward of this mechanistic view of the human person, then reason and conscience and the apprehension of beauty and things that are not beautiful, that's no longer regarded as being inborn, I guess.
And yet they still exist. People still experience all those elements of reality, just like matter, for example. Strictly speaking, not even the properties of matter are matter. Like color, for example, what in philosophy of mind they call qualia, because they can't think of where it's supposed to belong. If it's not in the material world, well, where does it go? Into
Hmm.
minds?
Hmm.
But
Right.
minds apparently don't exist either. So
Yeah.
even when you start with that, like your example of whiteness,
Yep.
what is it? Well, they can't account for it. And the problem is that
Yeah.
reason has been defined in a way that cannot accommodate any of these things. And it's been
Yes.
defined as only what can be quantified or empirically observed, for example, is allowed to
Hmm.
count as rational. And there's nothing about that proposition itself which can be quantified, for example.
Hmm.
It might
Yeah.
be written down in a book and be, I don't know, 4 inches long and printed in black text. But being 4 inches long and having black font and being a certain size, none of those things is actually inherent to the proposition itself.
Hmm.
The proposition isn't empirical. So it's self
Right.
refuting.
Yeah. Yeah. This is the dagger and the verificationist project that I mentioned before. Um, yeah, but these folks like Harris and Company, they'll somehow they don't, they do some sort of hand wavy move and onward they go. Um, I think a lot of it too is my buddy used to call it philosophical posing, where it's not even clear any of these folks really truly believe what they're saying. It's rather it's just they bite as many bullets as possible, and then they just stare at you with a poker face, and that's their stick. So like Dennett will say he's like an eliminatist even about intentionality. It's like he writes that, but I can't imagine that he really truly believes that.
Mm.
But it's good. It's a good show. It's a good thing to write about. It gets attention.
Yeah, there's something superficial about it in that sense, in that no one really lives as if it's true.
Right. Yeah.
You'd
Yeah.
just
But
be
it's
regarded
new.
as
You know what I mean?
insane if in court, for example, just saying, "Well, why did you kill that person? Why I didn't. I
Mhm.
don't have free will. I'm completely irrational. My actions are just like the rain falling."
Yeah. If somebody stole Dan Dennett's car or something, like suddenly his, suddenly intentionality and fairness and morality and the the regard for due process and all these all this ethical and ontological furniture of the world just blinks back into place, and it's suddenly there again.
Well,
Um,
that's
yeah,
Feser's point. He says that reason and morality are possible only within the classical Western philosophical religious framework, and an atheistic worldview is irrational, immoral, and insane. It looks like he's right the way things are turning out at the moment.
yeah. Well, it's funny where you'll see these folks like Harris. Um, you know, Harris tries to bootstrap consequentialism out of materialist neuroscience. Gad Saad, his book, The Parasitic Mind, tries to bootstrap deontology and regard for classical liberalism out of mere evolutionary science. Steven Pinker tries to bootstrap liberal democracy and regard for tolerance and pluralism out of bare neuroscience. Um, Dan Dennett has a talk on mental determinism, and but he comes so close to saying we ought to oppose radical jihadism. Uh, he has a TED talk on this you can find. Um, so all the Winograds on Quillette have an argument, the case for scientism, and then from there the defense of liberal democracy just drops out of scientism. So all these folks, you can tell that they're worried. Something in their being is concerned about radical Islam or wokeism or the threat of intersectionality. But now they're scrambling to find, well, what are the conceptual tools that I have at my disposal to respond to this? And it's like they're failing to let go of that. They want it both ways. They want to hang on to the materialist paradigm and still have all of the robustness of the ethical and rational norms that theology would have given them, but they're trying to pull it out of materialism, and it's embarrassing to watch because it's as if none of these folks encountered Hume's claim about the Azot fallacy or the Azot gap, and it's just crazy to watch as they're spastically trying to come up with a defense against these things, but without the conceptual resources that you can only find in theism.
I think that's why Feser says that his conversion was a matter of objective, rational argument, because what you just reasoned through there was saying that not only is this scientific position incoherent, but fundamentally, even if you tried to be consistent with it, you would just have no grounds for addressing the most fundamental areas of human life. It's an
No,
insane position in that sense.
it is. It's insane, and in most cases, I would say it's a disingenuous or philosophically, intellectually dishonest position. Like I said, if you really corner these folks behind closed doors, and they're not doing their public persona shtick, I bet you that they would admit that these ontological entities, they do believe that they exist.
So Feser argues that secularism can never truly rest on reason, and what you've been pointing out there is that it actually undercuts the possibility of reason itself. If
Hmm.
all your thoughts not only aren't about anything because they're just physical events,
Hmm.
but you also have no control over moving from premises to conclusions by the laws of logic, inference, deduction, then when you think on that view, it would literally just be like secreting saliva or bile, for example. It's just a physical process
Yeah.
that qualitatively no different.
Yeah, everything's just epiphenomenal. Science itself isn't possible because scientific consensus of other minds of the past that we're building upon, those weren't really minds at all. Yeah, so yeah, it's right. It's just like it's like you just start seeing how it just starts cannibalizing so much of their own foundations.
So raises the question then, why would anybody have that worldview? And Feser selects a line from Thomas Nagel, which suggests it's wishful thinking ultimately. I don't want there to be a God. My guess is that this cosmic authority problem is not a rare condition.
Mm.
And he gives various examples of this from biologists, physicists.
Yeah, yeah.
We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now, I don't know whether this is mainly about the authority problem, as Nagel says, or the fear that somehow allowing a divine foot in the door is necessarily anti science or irrational, according to
Mhm.
their view of what rationality means. Which one do you think it is more about?
Um, I, that quote, I think, was it Lewontin who said
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
Yeah, I think him in particular. I think he had a particular grudge against Christianity, and he was really um, looking to ensure that any theoretical or scientific theory that he was a part of was actively hostile or helping to bat out Christianity from the scientific and cultural worldview. Um, More generally, though, yeah, it might be a mix of um, of motivations, I suppose. Um, yeah.
I like how this turns the normal atheist psychological explanation for religious belief on its head. Because you'll
Hmm.
often hear people say, oh, you just believe because you want a sky daddy who looks after you.
Yep.
But you can just as plausibly, perhaps more plausibly, say that, well, you don't want it to be a cosmic judge.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Because the result is if there is no judgment, then do what thou wilt. Now is the extent of the law, and yeah, that's that's personally what that allows for psychologically, I guess.
yeah, hence the
Just this
connection between that and
license to not consider
exactly
the
that's it.
gravity of
Yeah.
one's action. Yeah.
The connection between that and sexual license that Fazer pointed out at the start.
Right, right. Yeah.
So ultimately, then, it seems like it's some kind of animus against religion. That's his conclusion. The animus against religion is not a mere feature of the secularist mindset, it is the only feature.
Mhm.
So there's no positive content to it. It's just anti religion, anti Christianity in
Mhm.
particular. Part of the
Right.
reason is the cosmic authority problem.
Yes.
So how does this make it like a counter religion itself then? I thought this was a really interesting part of the chapter.
Yeah, yeah, I thought so as well. And it once again it hits on the same notes as Havel's account of what constitutes ideology. But yeah, he points out that these folks they're not open minded. They're bringing in all sorts of presupposed uncritical commitments, and they're not questioning them as Dennett implores religious folks to do. Uh, they have their own gospels. They have their own apostles. They have strict penalties for heretics. And so the open mindedness or the calls for tolerance or pluralistic viewpoints it only ever goes one way towards their um, flattened atheist materialist view of the world, and it ends up functioning very much like one would describe a religion on their view. So
Yeah, we'll come to how it answers questions about meaning and identity and values. But it's interesting, given what you've been saying about the worldview being incoherent, and they want to talk about normative values, because
Mhm.
one of Feser's points about it is that the hypocrisy is clear to see. The way they speak is constantly sneaking in ideas about final causes and things
Right.
having
Yeah.
aims, goals, purposes. So the example he
Hmm.
gives is about Dawkins with genes manipulating people.
Hmm.
Now, that language of manipulation suggests intent and intelligence, and there's
Yeah.
no place for that on this worldview,
Yeah.
and yet they can't help talking with it.
Yeah. 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 It gets smuggled back in. Yeah. In the same way that I was mentioning before, the Harris and Company smuggling normativity of various sorts on their account. Yeah, they're also functioning, or they're also smuggling in telos and function and proper function in all of these worldviews as well.
Yeah, as if evolution knows what it's doing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, that's another example I was going to give. In a recent interview, Dawkins said that humans ought to all be vegan. People ought, right? They ought to all be vegan. Why? And he goes, well, it would be unevolutionary of us to not regard other species. Un, unevolutionary? What? What on earth? What on there's unevolutionary? I thought it's all just blind accident. There's so he just re you know um, rebuilds back in the normativity in a subtler way. So
Yeah,
but it's still there.
part of it, like we said with Havel, is because people have a craving for beliefs like that in their lives. And the religious explanation for that is that man is ultimately a metaphysical creature made
Mhm.
for God, ultimately. Unlike, say, a pig or a badger, which can't think in abstract terms, hasn't got a conscience.
Mm.
So, as they try to attack the image of God in man, which is free will and intellect, you see them being unable to remove it because that's what they are, and it expresses
Yes.
itself in different ways. So this is the idea of the counter metaphysics or the counter morality, and there's really nothing scientific about it. I think that's a really important point to grasp. You can't
Mhm.
stress it too much. There's nothing scientific about scientism. It's a purely philosophical position. So the idea that science is somehow the only field that is interested in truth, or the only one in which you can make rational claims,
Mhm.
well,
Yep.
that isn't a view established by science. No one found that out in a petri dish.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, certainly. So something just occurred to me though as to what might also be humming in the background motivating this thinking. And it it is this generally assumed progress narrative of either a moral or knowledge slash scientific sort that's humming in the background. So these folks might, whether they consciously recognize it or not, they might be thinking something like, well, um, morally and politically, we've been improving, and scientifically and knowledge wise, we've been improving in this sort of Popperian treasure chest of knowledge. Everybody is building upon the last person, and that therefore, if one ascribes to that, therefore anything in the past is a diminished version of whatever we have right now, and th- that is doing maybe a lot of some of the work here in getting their ideas popularized. Well, this is the newest thing, and in the past, Aristotle used to whatever he was a misogynist. He used to believe in humors, and now we have human rights, and we have quantum mechanics, and everything's an improvement, and that is that's equally just a religious claim as well. Improvement towards what? Um, progress towards what?
That's a good point. The standard view of all human cultures except ours is that the golden age is behind us
Mhm.
and the dark age is ahead, and things are steadily getting worse, and something like apocalypse is coming. That's
Pregnant
the
men.
universal myth. Yeah, the golden age is gone, Eden's gone. But with science in particular, because there have been real discoveries and advances in how we can manipulate nature and use it to our benefit, you can see how it lends itself to the idea that the dark ages are behind us and the
Mm-hmm.
golden age is ahead.
Right. Yeah.
I think, oh,
Yeah. So
yeah,
that narrative structure, I think, is uh, facilitating the adoption of the Harris and Company view in the mainstream. Independent of what the actual content is that they're saying and all these internal inconsistencies, the fact that it's just coming now in the 2000s as opposed to being said in the 1200s, that somehow is regarded just prima facie as being more true than whatever was said before, or evidence of improvement or evidence of a cumulative knowledge towards something getting better and better and better. Um, and no one regards the other point, that the C.S. Lewis point of, well, the progress towards what, the first man
mm,
who turns around if you're going the wrong way, that's progress. So it's that, I think, it greases the groove for the atheist materialist worldview to take within the culture.
yeah. They also assume that technological progress necessarily means civilizational progress.
Mm-hmm.
And
Exactly. Yeah.
that is part of the debate, isn't it? That's exactly the thing that is in question. And the
Yeah.
evidence suggests that it probably doesn't. I thought it was quite amusing that even Nietzsche points out there is no such thing as a science without any presuppositions. A philosophy, a faith, must always be there first. It is a metaphysical faith that underlies our faith in science. And you can see that if you think about all the different presuppositions that they make about science that science itself can't validate. I
Mm-hmm.
think if you start questioning the philosophy of science, then there's such a long list. You've got the reliability of the senses, for example. Science can't
Mm-hmm.
prove this because you have to
Yep.
assume that in any kind of experiment you use your senses in to figure it out. You've
Mm-hmm.
got the fact that the mind is rational, that the
Yep.
world is rational and consistent in such a way that the mind can even explore it and know it.
Yep. Yeah.
Science
Yeah.
can't prove this either. Then we've got boundary conditions, like on their view anyway, the brute given of the cosmos. You've got the mass of a proton, the rate of expansion after the Big Bang. You've got the laws of the logic. You've got the existence of other mind, ideas about fairness and consistency in
Mm-hmm.
discussing scientific results. All
Yeah.
these things are just assumed rather than
Yeah.
proven.
Yeah. Yeah. This is yeah, it makes me think that Harris and Company are, yeah, they're not just shallow in terms of their grasp on classic Aristotomist accounts, but they're rather shallow on their philosophy of science chops as well, and they're cutting a lot of corners and skimming over the surface of a lot of these issues in philosophy of science that, as you say, they have to be assumed in order to get working empirical, naive empiricism science off the ground.
That's it. And I think that, yes, it's willful ignorance, partly. I think it's also just contempt for entire fields within philosophy as somehow
Mm-hmm.
just being irrational and mysterious or fanciful. So I think it's actually a animosity towards not just religion but metaphysics itself more broadly.
I agree. Yes, and this trend, I ended up, for me, philosophy of mind became the ersatz religion that I fell back on when I fell away from Christianity. Then I ended up getting sort of back after going through Dennett and the Churchlands and all those folks. I ended up retreating back to ethics, and but even within those camps, you'll have folks like the emotivists or Blackburn and all these folks that'll say, well, the ethical propositions there, it's just, murder bad, um, weddings good, and that these things, family, I feel good feelings, death, I feel bad feelings, and that they don't rise, to the level of being meaningful propositions. They're just emotive sounds that we make, when it comes to what, um, and the Frege Geach answer to this, I think, clearly shows that normative claims are propositions, and that they behave and they logically respond to inference patterns like any non-normative proposition. So that just solves that very quickly. But the point being is that there's such a trend within analytic contemporary philosophy right now to chase, yeah, any gateway, any pathway towards theism is just being stamped out, whether it's ethics or metaphysics or philosophy of mind, or probably elements of logic too. They're just the, like any pathway needs to be shut off and aggressively policed.
And not for any kind of scientific reason. Feser's keen to stress that
Yeah.
naturalism isn't the result of a scientific discovery. And it's not like they've got really good philosophical reasons for trying to stamp out any roads towards theism either.
Right. Right.
So we're back to that point about animosity being the only real content. There's no positive content.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting that the new atheists never had any new atheist arguments. As far as I know, it's not like they rolled out, here are some really devastating, like new cutting edge. No one has thought of these arguments before. It's just really just a lot of animosity and bluster.
Yeah, I think um, Aquinas only thinks of two really good arguments as in worth considering against the existence of God. Just top of my head, I think he says, "What if the world is eternal, and then there's the existence of evil?" And he argues that even an eternal universe that's consistent with God because it's still not necessary. It didn't have to be that way. It's contingent somehow. And then
Hmm.
evil is an emotionally powerful argument, but not logically powerful. I have to check whether those are the only two, but just top of my head, I think that's it. And the new atheists don't go beyond either of those two.
Right. Not to my knowledge.
So we ending then with two main things to focus on. We've got throughout the book two themes to explore. It's a war between philosophical worldviews, not between religion and science. And in fact, science was stillborn everywhere apart from the Christian West, where the idea was that nature was the product of a supremely rational mind and that human beings shared in that mind somehow by being made in God's image and could therefore meet it and explore it through nature. So it's kind of a meeting of minds. You find the rationality, the beauty, the harmony in the universe, which is why, weirdly, inexplicably, on the naturalistic view, the most elegant, harmonious equations just happen to be the ones that accurately describe physical reality.
Hmm.
And then we've got the fact that religion and reason aren't opposed. Religion is the manifestation and fulfillment of reason. Feser even calls it the highest manifestation of reason, which makes sense on the Imago Dei view that reason partakes in God's reason.
Hmm. Yes. And this gets us back to why nominalism is such an important departure from the Western mind's capacity to think of man as being able to participate in that.
Yeah, precisely. And I think he picks out that he thinks that the most important problem is that there's virtually no understanding of the cosmological argument, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore no understanding of the corresponding argument for religious morality. He thinks the two things are
Mm-hmm.
combined. So I guess the most common misconception there is, well, if everything has a cause, what caused God?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, this is how it was taught to me as an undergrad. And yeah, God is just one big contingent cause locatable in time and space. And that conception of God is easily hand waved away by the question you just asked. Well, what caused that? So 8-year-old could ask that question, right? So just the idea of infinite regress in a linear sequence is is devastating to that account of God. But what folks don't recognize is the more sophisticated version of it, of God as a necessary being that sustains all being, not just a causal sequence in time and space, but a necessary being that makes all other beings, all other contingent beings possible at all.
Yeah,
Um,
it's just
and that's how Feser ends the chapter one.
yeah.
Did you catch that? Like he's like, I, I shouldn't paraphrase it. Um,
This is like when they say, well, if you believe in God, why don't you believe in Thor or Zeus?
right? Yeah. I'm an atheist. I believe in one less God than you do, or whatever the Carl
Yeah,
Sagan Dawkins bastardization of it is.
but the
Um,
difference is that Thor and Zeus are just beings among beings. They aren't
yeah.
being capital B, being
Right.
itself.
Yeah. Yeah, so he says, not to put too fine a point on it, they ought literally to get down on their knees and worship the God who mercifully sustains them in being at every instant, even as they foolishly scoff at him. So that is the God that Aquinas and Aristotle and Avicenna are all trying to articulate, not God as big contingent cause.
Yeah. So the you, me, everyone watching, the whole of reality would just blink out of existence if it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't being sustained right now by the creative
Yeah,
action of God. It's not
yeah,
something that happened a long time ago, Big
yeah,
Bang, and then you leave it. It's
yeah,
ongoing continually.
yeah. To include the truth of all propositions prior to human existence. Something what sustains those is true prior to man.
Exactly it. Uh, Questions to finish. Isn't it that people have become hedonistic? So they naturally see progress as something that just enables more pleasure and have
Mm-hmm.
forgotten that pleasures can mean anything else. Yeah, well, we haven't got a pleasure organ. There's no specific, I just feel pleasure in the abstract. You take pleasure in drinking so that you stay hydrated. You take pleasure in sex, so it's an inducement to procreate. You take pleasure in food, so you get nutrition. Pleasure's always got some kind of aim to get you to do
Mm-hmm.
something. But I suppose if you take away the idea that there are purposes or aims in nature,
Mm-hmm.
then you might disconnect what pleasure is from what it's actually for. And I can see that hedonism being the result of that. I don't think it makes sense though.
Right. Ultimately, no. And I think people can have they can have misoriented or dysfunctional goods that they're aimed at. C.S. Lewis gives an account of the kid making mud pies in an alley and his parents trying to convince him, hey, we're going to go to the beach, and he's never been to the beach. So it's how do you convince if people haven't had the firsthand experience of moving towards eudaimonia or towards higher expressions of good or flourishing. What then is what's the argument to move them beyond mere mere cessation of pain and pleasing of appetites. And I guess reason, if they reason long enough, then they will see that that's not what humans are built for. We're not built to roll around in the mud like pigs. That's not our highest good.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that so much of life is actually about, on some level, a degree of suffering being unavoidable, and the religious worldview accounts for that coherently,
Mm.
and it's got a purpose to it. I think that's another disconnect between the two philosophical worldviews that are in opposition here, because there really is no place for suffering on the naturalistic worldview. Not only can they not even say what it is, given that that isn't really a state of mind, it's just some kind of arbitrary brain state that isn't about anything. Pain's just
Yeah,
an epiphenomenon that doesn't mean anything at all. It means
yeah,
nothing more or less than pleasure, for example.
yeah,
But given it's subjectively unpleasant, then you just want it to stop and you just want as much pleasure as possible.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that this is also the view of everything reducing down to just a management of individual or collective suffering units, or individual collective heat-on units. This is what takes us to some of the insane views of somebody like Singer, who he mentions, the preference utilitarian, who endorses things like bestiality and polyamory and was it cannibalism? I don't know. I forget what the third one was, but it
He's
was
a
like if
speciesism guy, isn't he? So if you
yeah,
say that
yeah, yeah,
killing a human is worse than killing an ant, that's speciesist.
that speciesist, and then it cuts the other way where it's just like, well, if you want to whatever bang a cow, then go ahead, go and do it because it's as long as the cow's feeling good and you're feeling good, it's as long as you satisfy conditions of cow consent, you're off to the races. Good for you. And it's just
Well,
like
there's no species
yeah, if
anyway.
everything's just a swirling of pleasure and suffering units with no boundaries,
Well, it's
then
back to
that's
the primordial soup. There's just bits of matter smashing into each
yes,
other by blind chance and necessity. Species don't exist, really.
yeah, right, yeah, yeah. These are arbitrary, false constructions.
Like we said at the start, small mistakes in the beginning lead to big
Yep.
ones in the end. The
Yes.
cow scenario outlined there might seem ridiculous, but that's the whole point. Logically, it's a reductio ad absurdum of those beginning premises. Uh,
Yep.
Last question: is modernity's progress the antithesis to our essence, and therefore Satanism? Interesting. As we're continually deviating and widening the gap from our sinless origins. Well, we can't have an essence on this worldview, can we? That's the
No.
whole point. It denies that things
Yep.
have essences.
Denies essence. Who's the pope who wrote modernism is a synthesis of all heresies? Do you know what I'm talking about? I'm forgetting this.
I know the quote. I can't think who it was though. Let's find it out.
Yeah.
It wasn't
Um.
Pope Leo, was it? Top of
I,
my head.
I that was what I was thinking.
Yeah, we'll check.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. But I mean that at least I'd like to go back and have a look at that to see if this removal of essences is somehow, if he accounts for that within that view.
the idea that it's the antithesis to our essence and therefore Satanism would actually relate to the earlier question about Gnosticism, which is the idea that somehow man, by commanding nature and in the end human nature, can become like a god. So it links back to the counter religion point that we raised earlier. It's the pride in scientific discovery, meaning that
Mhm.
you have no need of a savior. Pope Pius X, apparently, someone's just looked it
Okay.
up. Pope Pius
All right.
X.
Cool.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
people can look it up and read it. Modernity is the synthesis of all heresies. Thanks, Nicholas, for finding that for us. All right, guys, we covered a lot today, and I hope everyone manages to read chapter 2 for next week, where we'll be getting into some of the fundamentals of the Platonic Aristotelian worldview that was abandoned and led to some of the absurdities that we've discussed today. Thanks, Dr. Robillard. Good to see you.
Thank you, Will. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I'll see you guys next week.
Take care.